one.
Hi, welcome to the third in a series of webinars on network leadership and design. This series, hosted by the Children in Nature Network and the Bay Area Children in Nature Collaborative, is a response to the growing interest in and need to apply network leadership approaches to grow the movement to reconnect children and nature. I'm Avery Cleary, co-founder of the Bay Area Children in Nature Collaborative and consultant with the Children in Nature Network. And it's my pleasure to speak with Jane Wei Skillern as she responds to questions from the first webinar in September, where she shared the 4 network principles for collaboration success. And we may also hear, she won't be on camera, but we may also hear at some point from Mary Roscoe, who is the coordinator and co-founder for Bay Area Children in Nature Collaborative. So we have a simple agenda today. Just welcome everyone. We're really excited that you chose to join us. And we hope that any questions you have, you'll put in the chat. There's so many people on the line, we really can't have an open mic, but if you would type your questions in the chat, we'll do our best to get to those as well. Jane will do a review of the 4 network principles that she talked about in the first webinar. And then there are 3 sets of questions that Mary Roscoe was kind enough to take all of the questions that people had from last webinar and that people have asked subsequently, and kind of put them into 3 different categories. So we'll take a look at those after Jane reviews the 4 network principles. But for those of you who were not on the first webinar, I just want to say that Jane Wei Skillern is an adjunct associate professor at the Center for Nonprofit and Public Leadership at the University of California, Berkeley. She holds a PhD from Stanford, and her research focuses on effective social enterprise leadership and management, examining how leaders that focus on and invest in building strategic networks beyond their own organizational boundaries can achieve dramatic gains in mission impact with the same or fewer resources. So Jane, I just want to say before we jump into you doing a review of the principles,
Yes.
Since your last presentation, we've heard from a number of people who have had great success with collaborative projects using actually the 4 principles that you identified and so clearly articulated, that they were amazed that you actually described a process that they've been using for years.
Yes.
But they didn't know they were using that process.
Yes.
One example of that is Robin Moore and Nilda Costo with the Natural Learning Initiative out of North Carolina State College of Design, said that they've been using this process and were just really validated to hear what you had said about it, because both Robin and Nilda, through their work, are really responsible. Many people on the line probably know of their work, and because they've had a host of groundbreaking achievements and major collaborative accomplishments to advance the movement to connect children and nature. I think that your work is helping bring to light, how did they do what they do?
Yes.
In the field even, and how can they explain it to funders? So just wanted you to know that, that's another bonus that's happening with your work, that by introducing new people to the concepts, but also validating people who've been using these concepts for years. So with that, I'll turn it over to you to give us a review of the 4 principles.
Thank you so much, Avery. And that example that you just shared actually is quite common. In fact, I would say virtually all of the subjects that I have studied that have done this work well, that is their primary reason for engaging with me in this research, because they did not learn it from me, but rather have been working in this way and are glad to have it recognized and articulated by somebody like me that helps them communicate to others their approach, the validity of the approach, the power of the approach. And frankly, these folks are also busy in their day jobs doing the actual work that they don't have time to reflect and think about it at that macro level of what it actually looks like and what it's different and how and why it works. It's almost second nature, which is not to say that it can't be learned, hence our interest in offering these webinars, because it very much is a set of norms and leadership principles that indeed can be adopted by any type of organization, whether large or small, whether already highly networked or just trying to move into this and is taking baby steps toward that. So I will go very briefly through these 4 principles because I know many of our participants have already seen the first webinar, and I have a host of publications that lay these out in short form and in long form. So if you want, say, the short version of the 4 principles, the introduction to the blog series in SSIR that was just posted in the chat box would be a great place to start. If you want the very long version with detailed case examples, the Geo Network Code publication, which is available as a PDF, and we'll have that listed as the last slide as resources. That would give you very extensive, detailed examples to illustrate the principles. But I'll go through them quickly so we're all on the same page as far as clarifying what I mean by network leadership and network entrepreneurship. So the 4 network principles really come from, as I alluded to in my opening comments, to a way of working that I have identified across a range of successful networks in different contexts, different types of organizations, from executive directors to staff members kind of further down the line, that this is a way that they have led and influenced others and engaged others in a systematic way. It's a set of norms and behaviors that characterizes these very successful networks that I've looked at over the past 15 years. So they're quite straightforward, but I think one thing that's quite interesting to note, and we'll get to it in the questions, is that the mission, trust, humility, and this node, not hub aspect, those elements are perhaps not typically the norms that we see as rewarded or incentivized in philanthropy in general. That typically there's this focus on organizations and control and ensuring quality and emphasizing growing the brand and visibility for the organization. And also the hub notion of being the market leader and dominating. So it's just an interesting contrast that we'll get to in the question and answer, but I thought it would be useful for you to think about that tension as I'm talking about some of these principles, because I'm very aware of that reality, but I believe that the norms in the sector are gradually changing to be more focused and amenable to the first set of norms, the mission, the trust, the humility, and the network, rather than individual organizations as ultimately the vehicle for change. So this mission, not organization concept really is that in all of these examples, I have seen leaders who are doing work in somewhat counterintuitive ways. They will sometimes fundraise on behalf of a peer organization. Even if the money doesn't pass through their organization, they don't get any benefit, but they see it as a complement to their work because their peer organization's work helps to support their broader mission. So even if it's a program area that they aren't offering or delivering, they see the benefit for their shared beneficiaries to have. And so they'll take the time to help advance the field more broadly. So they'll do things like fundraise on behalf of participants or peers in their networks. They might potentially even invest resources into a peer's operations, programs, allow their peer to make key decisions on control, even if there was an investment of financial resources from their peer. So it was this unusual way of working, of giving away resources, maybe letting go of control at the same time, and even giving up recognition in many cases, that got me thinking, wow, this is very different. But what's fascinating is they are advancing mission impact, but not necessarily advancing the organization. So that is a basic idea behind the first principle. The second is that these networks are governed far more by trust-based relationships and really deep, authentic relationships amongst participants, rather than contracts or performance measurement systems and things like that. Now, it's not to say that you can't have formal contracts or have performance metrics and systems in place, but that's really not the glue that's holding everything together. It's that these participants, the players, both at the individual and the organizational level, have engaged with each other to a degree that there is a deep level of trust and authentic communication, that there's a willingness to admit mistakes, a willingness to say, oh, we need to make a course correction. What we're doing here isn't working, and this is what we're learning from the field. This is what we're learning from our beneficiaries. That there's that ongoing openness of communication, that it's okay to acknowledge that you didn't do everything perfectly. You don't have to continually self-promote and always be in control in order to get to the greatest impact. This gets me to the third related principle of humility, rather than a focus on brand building and promoting the organization. And this takes form in a number of different ways, one of which is just from a very fundamental level, is that participants don't pretend to be the smartest person in the room or to have all the answers or to have the silver bullet solution. That they, in fact, are very, very keenly aware and make it public that they don't have all the answers. They have a resource, a contribution, an innovation, a programmatic expertise, whatever that might be, that they're willing and eager to contribute. But at the same time, they know that the contributions of their network participants, whether it's financial or technical expertise or a related program delivery expertise, that all of those are equally valuable and important to ultimately getting to the mission. So there's this openness and a willingness to learn and adapt and even change their own ways of working in order to get to the greatest impact. And likewise, when the work is done or when achievements have been accomplished, that there's not this fight to jockey for position of who gets the most credit or be the dominant player or get kind of the most recognition for their work. Instead, these network entrepreneurs have actually become very skilled at making other people look good. That they'll put the spotlight on someone else, even if the spotlight is shining on them. And I've seen that in cases where a number of instances, from Habitat Egypt to the Energy Foundation, where the CEO of the organization is invited to the podium to speak, and they're turning the attention to their peers within their networks who actually did much of the work alongside them. So again, the notion of it's not about me or the organization or our brand name, it's about what do we need to do to get to the greatest impact. And I can tell you that this dynamic of treating people as your peers and your equals, no matter what you're bringing to the table, and then this humility, that builds this reservoir of goodwill amongst the participants in the network that makes them want to continue to engage and invest because they see the impact that's being achieved, but at the same time, they feel like they're not only contributing, but also benefiting from the broader network's achievements. There's no worry that they're going to be exploited, that if they invest their resources or their time and energy, then when the work is done, someone else is going to claim credit for it. That will ultimately make networks fall apart when there's that dynamic of competition, and we have to be the ones who get credit for that and be out front all the time. So that's, again, an interesting contrast to what we're typically seeing in a lot of organizations, in a lot of fields. And finally, this notion, and again, all of these principles are interrelated. So it is sometimes hard to pull them apart as far as, well, how is this different from that? So as I talk about humility and that understanding that we are only one part of the solution, this gets me to the final principle, which is a mindset and thinking about the work as you're not trying to be the center of the universe or to be the brightest star, but really, how do I build this constellation of stars that makes the big picture? Because ultimately, most and probably virtually all social impact issues are going to require collaboration across a range of organizations and across sectors. So that mindset and willingness to see your work as one of many pieces of a larger puzzle as being critical to getting to the impact is going to lead to very, very different decisions at the organizational level, at the governance level, at the strategic decision-making level. And I'll just share an illustration from slides. These are actually from Habitat for Humanity, a colleague of mine who I have studied and learned a lot from. He was at the C-suite level in Habitat, and these are some of their planning documents as they try to shift their own organization's work from Habitat for Humanity in the left diagram. Habitat is in the middle, and all of their partners are right around them. And each decision is, what can we do to advance the organization? And the shift, and it's still happening now. I just have been in conversations with one of their vice presidents in the Latin American region. They're still working on this transition to this node model where shelter and affordable housing is at the center. They play a very important role in that, being the largest NGO in the sector in the world. But at the same time, there are all these other organizations right around that. And I apologize for the very small font. I know it's a strain on most people probably over the age of 35, 40. So the purpose of putting those two slides next to each other was really to juxtapose the contrast in the way of thinking. When we go from thinking about the organization as a vehicle for change to the mission as the vehicle for change and the network of which you're a part to get there. So I guess that's the principles in a nutshell. And I think we can move on to questions.
Great. Well, I'm getting a little echo here.
Your line is now unmuted.
I'm seeing, I'm going to take this off. Can you hear me better now without an echo?
I can hear you, though. I'm getting
great.
A little bit of, and are you able to hear me? Because
I can hear you now. Yeah, sorry about that.
Now, yeah, we're good, Avery.
Okay, thanks. So as I mentioned, Mary Roscoe was kind enough to take all of the questions that came in last time and since and put them in 3 buckets. So we're just, whatever you can share on this webinar about these, and then you'll probably point us to some other readings that we can get more in-depth feedback on. But these 2 questions relate to funding. The first one is, how do we work with the perceived risk in working with the 4 principles in a competitive environment? And how do we attract investments and needed resources when our work may be less visible?
Sure. So this is certainly a very stark reality that I am aware of and have seen. And in fact, this is the motivation for the research that I've been doing, is to raise visibility of an alternate model that is counter to what we typically see in the sector, because I have no doubt the vast majority of philanthropic funders and the norms and expectations currently in the sector are around organization success, growth, brand building, recognition, and becoming a leader in the field, right? That's what so many organizations are striving for day in and day out. And there's no doubt as to why that's happening, because funders are driving that behavior, and indeed even our governing boards are driving toward institutional level gains rather than mission or field level gains in many cases. And that's what a lot of this work that I'm doing seeks to address. So at the field level, I'm trying to address it by bringing greater awareness to an alternative path that is more impactful, that does get to more efficient, effective, and sustainable results. And then maybe at the individual organization level, I could share an example from one of the cases that I've looked at, because I do agree that there are, in the short term, potentially short-term losses as to maybe a loss of a particular funder that was supportive of a more traditional way of working, or decreased recognition for your work because you're sharing the load with your peers, but at the same time, the attribution is somehow harder to put a finger on. And funders usually like to be able to point directly to kind of a linear, I gave money to this cause and this happened, and therefore I can feel really happy with the investment that I've made. But I think that the norms in the field more broadly are absolutely shifting. That over the past 15 years that I've been at this work, I have never been in a context more open to this model of working and really hungry for this way of working for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that virtually everybody agrees that we need system level, cross-organizational, cross-sector level approaches to get to real impact on most of these issues that we're working on. And at the same time, people are looking at innovation, but not necessarily innovation in, say, a program innovation, which may be the last decade or two when social entrepreneurship was really big and there was a focus on kind of silver bullet solutions or organizations where new models were being introduced, and it was assumed that, well, if these new models could just grow to scale, we'll solve these problems. There's now an understanding that it's going to take a lot more than just one organization or one great idea to solve these intractable problems, these systemic issues. And so now it's becoming to be viewed as cutting edge, that if you're working in a very engaged network level way, across organizations, across sectors, that's very innovative and that's very progressive. And so funders are looking for those types of funding opportunities and are more eager to fund collaborations than they ever have been. But at the same time, working in this way, because the impacts are so powerful, that the work begins to speak for itself and attracts funding and attracts supporters over time. And I'm not saying that it's easy, but I have seen this happen. So for example, one of the cases that I've written up in a number of my articles, and there's a detailed HBS case study that you can get on the Harvard Business School publishing website. And the case studies, they're about $5 a copy for the case studies themselves. But the Guide Dogs for the Blind Association case was an organization that had a 100-year history, was very, very well established as a leading player in the visually impaired sector in the UK. It happened to be the world's largest trainer and breeder of guide dogs. At the same time, their own research showed that they weren't meeting their mission effectively. They were serving about 5,000 guide dog owners a year. And they realized that there were 200,000 people in the UK that were visually impaired in need of mobility services. So you see that gap. They succeeded on traditional metrics, size, brand recognition, fundraising success, etc. But they were meeting the needs of 5,000 people when there were 200,000 people in need of those types of services. So they had a new CEO come in, Geraldine Peacock, who started to work in these very unconventional ways, as I talked about in the 4 principles. So they had a few program areas. They had guide dogs, that was their core program service area. Then they had hotels for guide dog owners, actually owned properties in tourist destinations in the UK that were hotels dedicated to guide dog owners. And even if those hotels were filled at maximum capacity every single day of the year, they would still lose money on their operations because they were subscale. That wasn't something that Guide Dogs was an expert at running, and a number of reasons that it just wasn't core to their programmatic efforts, but at the same time, they had a period of time where they were relatively wealthy and could move into expanded program areas, and so they did. Similarly, they had a travel agency that was dedicated to providing travel opportunities for their guide dog owners. Again, similar to the hotels where they were losing money, wasn't efficiently run, and it wasn't really core to their mission, although their beneficiaries valued those services. So what Guide Dogs did was found former competitors in each of those fields, other nonprofits that ran hotels for people with different types of just a range of disabilities, gave away those programs and the actual ownership in many regards to their peers, and then at the same time invested millions of pounds, or actually translates to 1.5 times in terms of dollars, like tens of millions of dollars, into the hotel properties as well as the travel agency program to ensure that their partners who had full control over operations got full recognition and credit for any gains that were achieved through those programs and got out of those businesses. So it actually gave away programs while investing in them in order to focus on its core services, mobility programs. Now, again, some people might argue they shouldn't have given away Guide Dogs resources, but at the same time, they knew that their beneficiaries valued a suite of services, and they shouldn't necessarily be the ones to offer them if there was someone else better at doing it. So what ultimately happened was they did a series of these types of partnerships that then attracted the interest of the government, where the government established a $100 million fund for other such partnerships because Guide Dogs happened to be a wealthy organization and could invest to subsidize these partnerships. But the government knew that other organizations perhaps didn't have that financial reserve, the capital reserve, but had the opportunity to engage in this way. So there was a $100 million fund called the Future Builders that was established to promote this type of working in the field. It also paved the way for Guide Dogs to partner with local government agencies to offer a range of services to the visually impaired community with leverage, where Guide Dogs committed certain resources and the local government contractually committed to offer matching services. So it was a one-to-one leverage. So they actually expanded the size of the pie for the entire field. And at the same time started to change the culture in the field, which had been very adversarial, very competitive, everyone for himself, fighting like cats and dogs in many respects, over financial resources and credit and recognition. And people began to see Guide Dogs as a very different organization, as one that was a good partner, a trustworthy partner, and they were viewed as leaders and innovators in the field. And just to give you another indication of the increased visibility that it did bring to Guide Dogs, Geraldine Peacock, the CEO of Guide Dogs, was later recruited to become the head charity commissioner of the UK, which is a position in the UK. It's a cabinet level position, which we don't have a counterpart here in the US. But as the head charity commissioner, she jokes she went from being kind of a poacher to the game warden in the sector, that she was the regulator of the entire field. And she got into that position and was recruited for her visionary leadership and implementation of networked approaches in Guide Dogs for the Blind Association. So it not only brought greater resources to the field, it brought greater visibility to the organization and brought greater credibility to Geraldine Peacock as a leader and an innovator and a true dedicated leader toward the impact, not just her organization. So it can actually benefit your organization in the long term, but it of course takes time to invest in the relationships and see the networks bear fruit. But the fruit are so powerfully addictive, I guess, in the sense of the effectiveness, the efficiencies that are gained, that people do take notice. And that's where you can start getting these wonderful synergies of supporters of this way of working, rather than kind of people having to fly under the radar and try to do this without the support that they need.
That's really, really helpful to hear, the examples and where you see the trend going. And of course, you're talking about a lot of people working together, a lot of different organizations working together. So lots of questions come up about, well, what do we have to agree on? So if you can speak to the need for agreement, where we need it and where we don't, the specific questions that came up were, does success depend on several organizations agreeing to these principles on collaboration? And, how do we work with organizations with more traditional leadership approaches that may not agree or feel comfortable with the core principles or that kind of approach?
Yes. So I absolutely agree that success of these networks depends on multiple organizations working in this way. You can't have one organization abiding by these four principles and then other organizations working in more traditional kind of transactional, short-term, limited engaged approaches. That simply will make a network fall apart from the get-go. But it's certainly possible to engage and work with organizations that do have more traditional leadership approaches. And it doesn't even have to happen all at once. So many times I've seen these networks emerge just on a bilateral basis, just as we saw with the guide dogs case example. Guide dogs didn't transform the culture in the visually impaired charitable sector overnight. They started with the hotel partnership and just had that one bilateral arrangement with a former competitor, giving away the hotel operations, getting them off their programmatic focus, but at the same time supporting their peers to do that and doing it with great success. Then worked on the travel agency piece, and then worked on government agency partnerships. And then it started to get some buzz where people started to see the bigger picture. And Geraldine herself even says she didn't even have it all planned as this grand blueprint of what she was going to execute. It just made sense. In each of those strategic decisions, she asked herself, where am I going to get the most impact? What should I do in order to sustain these services, but not continue to lose money at them and shortchange our beneficiaries? And the clearest answer was, well, I should network my way out of this and give those programs away and support others to do it because they're valuable services, but we're not good at doing it. Somebody else is better at doing it, and I'll invest resources to support my peer to do that. And that actually costs me less over the long run, even if I don't get credit to say I run hotels, I run travel agency, I run mobility services. I can't say I offer the full suite of services, but at the same time, I'm better able to focus on what I do well and do it even better and do more of it. So it's something that you just can ease into little by little. I'll give you a great example from the research. This is one of my more recent case studies, is Energy Foundation China. So Energy Foundation is the largest foundation in the US that focuses on advocating or supporting a clean energy future. And they fund advocacy organizations, Union of the Concerned Scientists, NRDC, et cetera, to actually advocate, and regional coalitions to advocate against coal power plants and cleaner energy sources, solar, et cetera. And they also have operations in China, which they started about 20 years ago, about 20 years ago. And at the time, Energy Foundation already had a very strong track record in the US of promoting clean energy standards in America through more direct advocacy. Now, if you think about translating that model to China, that is known worldwide as a more authoritarian government regime, direct confrontational advocacy is not likely to get you very far as mission impact. So what they did as one of the first NGOs in China in general, and then working on the energy field, which is a very tricky one because they need to be working very closely with government officials, regulators, policy think tanks, et cetera, is that they didn't have a whole lot of direct expertise in that field. So they first hired local staff that deeply understood the culture, had firm grasp of the language, of course, and sought to play a support role to those players who were researchers, policymakers, and really offered their support to say, we know you're trying to determine kind of the larger strategic plan for the nation, or you're working on a particular policy around urban planning in this region. Sometimes they would work at the national level, sometimes they would work at the more local level, and they would call on their global network of experts and bring experts from around the world to introduce world-class knowledge to the influential thought leaders, decision makers, researchers, to give them access to the best knowledge on transportation, urban planning, solar, emission standards for power plants, or fuel efficiency standards for vehicles. So they equipped their partners with that information without asking for anything. They didn't ask for any payment. They didn't ask for recognition. In fact, they were especially careful to be very humble that even when there were gains in, say, a policy decision that was favorable, say a stricter fuel efficiency standard, they made the government official or the think tank that actually did the work and received the grant the credit. They gave them the recognition. And over time, people went from wondering why Energy Foundation was doing what they were doing, because usually people said, when you're an international or expat organization coming into our country, you're coming here to make money. What are you doing here, Energy Foundation? Aren't you here to make money? And the fact that Energy Foundation was there with the primary intention to get the best knowledge to the decision makers so that they could develop national standards for fuel efficiency, renewable energy. That was their goal. That was their mandate. And they did it without the expectation of recognition or control or anything. So over time, over many, many years, they became very trusted as government sources for advice on what policy decisions should be made. And they became then amongst the most influential in helping China establish their first fuel efficiency standards that were nationwide, or the first renewable energy legislation that was nationwide. That Energy Foundation was able to play a very instrumental role because they invested in a very patient and deliberate way to support the people doing the work on the ground, to do the work well. And when it came time to share recognition, they did not seek the limelight. There was no benefit to Energy Foundation building a big brand name for itself in China. What they really sought to do was get to the best policy changes, and they have succeeded in doing that and continue to do that. But I think that example is a great illustration of the fact that you can go from working with a partner that is very traditional and kind of top-down approaches to working alongside you because they trust you, they know you have high integrity, that you have strong values toward the mission. And China cares as much about the energy situation as Energy Foundation does. They've had huge issues with pollution, air quality, all that this is an issue that the Chinese government is seeking help on. And because Energy Foundation was there 20 years ago investing in those relationships, they are now amongst the go-to people for advice on how to deal with a lot of these issues going forward.
Really, really helpful to have you underscore the relationship building, the trust building, the going slow, to really not kind of come in and try to force these principles on people would actually be counter to working with the principles. So it's helpful to hear examples again of who has been successful doing this. Then this is the last question we have prepared, and then there are some questions in the chat. Hopefully we'll have time to get to them. This is about sustaining engagement. And what is the best way to start and maintain strong relationships with partners within the network and bridge with members of other networks? Kind of just exactly what you were talking about, but
sure. So thanks. It really is a long-term process, as you could probably imagine, and it's an ongoing process. That even after you've established relationships with partners, there's staff turnover, there's leadership changes, there's new staff that new board members, changes in the broader context that you're constantly investing and reinvesting. So it's not a matter of, say, everybody signing on, committing to these principles, and then once you get everyone to agree and sign on to them at the outset, then you're done. It really is this ongoing process and a reinforcement of those principles through action, not words, but action. And again, people who are consistently engaging authentically and showing their commitment through decisions that show their commitment to the mission, not just their own interests, those are the ones that are helping to reinforce those values in the network on an ongoing basis. I think at the very outset, one of the key things that's important to keep in mind is just the due diligence process that's required to find good partners. That it's not a matter of choosing people who have kind of the best reputation as far as brand recognition or kind of the likely suspects in the field because of their stature or standing in the field, but rather really going maybe a level or two or three deeper to find out who's a really good partner, who has a reputation for playing well with others in the sandbox, who's had a lot of impact on the ground, but in a maybe more quiet way. And finding those people who are already working in this way, because as I always say, the people who have done this work, the people that I've studied and learned from and developed these lessons from, they were doing it long before I ever came along. So I have no doubt in my mind that all over the world, in every context, in every field, there are people working in this way. And they happen to generally not be sought after or necessarily rewarded or recognized, but they are out there. So one is just the due diligence process of finding others of like mind that are equally committed to mission impact above all else. That's key. And say, for example, the Habitat for Humanity Egypt example that I used in the first webinar, they had a roughly 6-month process before they would actually commit to a formal partnership with anyone in their network. They had a waiting list of a dozen or so organizations that wanted to work with them, and they would spend 6 months getting to know the leaders, getting to know the beneficiaries of these organizations to find out if they had been treated fairly, consistently. Was there discrimination happening in the field? Was there nepotism happening with the resources? Were they being used wisely? Were those resources being stewarded wisely? They would have volunteer events and invite potential partners to come to a neighboring community and build houses with no opportunity for resources or any direct benefit in the short term. But over time, it was kind of a test to see who's willing to invest and commit for our larger cause without any direct benefit. And as they began to work with these potential partners over time, they saw who was very committed and who was there for the right reasons, for the mission reasons, not just to get the next dollar in the door. So finding those partners and doing the due diligence to ensure that they are good candidates for collaborating with is really important. And at the same time, of course, we have to look in the mirror and reflect on whether we and our organizations are trustworthy, high integrity partners that are also walking the talk, because you can't expect such high expectations of your partners, but at the same time not deliver to the same level. So there's kind of this delicate dance that needs to happen amongst potential partners as they get to know each other and understand each other's motivations and commitments and willingness to sacrifice in some cases in the short term in service to the mission and to get those network benefits that do take a while to develop. So that's one of the key things. And then as far as managing and maintaining the relationships on an ongoing basis, it goes back to what I had talked about earlier on of kind of authentic communication, trust-based relationships that are demonstrating your commitment to the broader impact of the network. And with the Habitat Egypt example again, so for example, with the model, 90% of the capital for the housing programs was provided by Habitat Egypt. Their partners committed 10% of the capital. And then Habitat provide all the technical assistance and the support for how you select homeowners and manage the loans and manage repayments, but they gave all the control to their peers and their partners. And there was a partner that said, well, it's interesting, Habitat Egypt, you're serving the people in our community who can't afford to finance and rebuild and remodel and improve their homes. But what about the poorest of the poor in our community who have no money, that actually are even more in need, but don't fit your organizational model because they can't repay the loans, because Habitat loans have to be repaid. It's a revolving fund. So one partner proposed, well, how do we meet the needs of those people? Because it's our mission. We're supposed to be providing shelter to those most in need, and your mission is enabling us to do that. So what Habitat Egypt offered then was to this partner, well, why don't you take that 10% of capital you'd usually pay to us, Habitat Egypt, take that 10% and you develop your own program to provide houses for the poorest of the poor in your community. And that put an additional fundraising burden on Habitat Egypt, because then they needed to increase their fundraising capabilities in order to allow their peer and their partner to develop this new program. But Yusri Makar, who was the national director of Habitat Egypt, said, this was exactly what I was after from a mission perspective, because it was reinforcing the values of delivering on the mission as best that we can with the resources that we have. And it was easier for me to go fundraise a little bit more money and enable my partner to first get the expertise and the experience of developing and creating a custom program to meet their community needs. And I was happy to support that effort. And then what they did was then offered that program to all of the other participants in their networks. So there was this learning from the bottom up rather than Habitat Egypt dictating to their partners, this is what you must do, and you're going to follow to the letter exactly what we say, and there's no room for change or improvement. That Habitat Egypt itself was eager to learn and improve and support their partners to serve the mission, rather than have Habitat dictate. And if you think about it, Habitat was really acting as a funder, right? They provided 90% of the capital. So they could have used the upper hand, but in many cases, in most cases I see with network leadership, people who have the opportunity to use the upper hand don't often use it. In fact, they take the high road and actually support people almost above and beyond what would be expected. And it's not altruism, but it really is in service to the mission. And so the more you have these types of behaviors, you can imagine the buzz that might have happened amongst the Habitat Egypt network participants is, oh, if we have an idea that serves the mission, we should run it by Habitat Egypt and see what they think. And if they think it's a good idea, they'll not only let us do it, but they'll share it with the whole network. And that's how we'll get to bigger impact. And ultimately, it served Habitat Egypt's mission, which was to enable these communities to serve their own needs without Habitat's ongoing intervention. Habitat Egypt was very clear that they wanted an exit strategy. And what better results could they have gotten than to have their partner saying, we want to address this issue in housing and shelter that isn't being addressed. We need a little bit of seed capital to do it, but we're going to run with it. And that's ultimately the mission impact and the success that probably every Habitat program would have wanted, but that was certainly an outlier. But you need that network dynamic and that network culture in order for these types of things to surface and flourish.
Fascinating, really fascinating. One thing I want, there's a question in the chat.
Yes.
And then I do want to be sure we also talk about your latest research or article that we had talked about before we went on air, the 5 steps for building an effective impact network, because I think a lot of people are wondering, okay, but where do I start? You know, is there a process? But a question from the chat came in and it says, from Emily in Washington, can you shed light on what kinds of minimum specifications, so to speak, are necessary for this kind of self-organizing network to thrive, perhaps beyond the 4 principles? For example, how much specificity does a shared vision need to have? What about communication and dispersed control of that communication? You know, are there some core segments around the how of what we do? So I'm thinking your article definitely really speaks to that about the 5 steps to building, but is there anything else you would want to share before we look at that?
Sure. And I'm just trying to get a clearer sense of. So I would say the most critical element that I see that undergirds all of this is the trust amongst participants, amongst network members. And it's not just that I can trust you, but I, myself, and my organization are trustworthy also. So again, I don't think needs to have a lot of structures or systems or things in place at the outset to make this work. It's in many ways, it's people getting to know each other as people, having authentic relationships with each other. And it's like building a relationship with somebody where, you know, there are some people that you really can relate to, you understand, you have shared values, that you see that you're on the same path, that is probably a better predictor of whether or not you can engage and work well together than, say, kind of you were to take key accomplishments or achievements of an organization, of kind of what's their market share, what's their budget size, how many staff do they have. Those things may look good. Kind of, it's I guess you could, maybe an analogy, I might have used this in the past in our other webinar, but it's almost like dating. It's like finding a partner, a marriage partner, right? That the resume, the actual resume of the person might matter to some degree, but it's really, is there alignment on shared values? Is there alignment on how we interact and communicate openly? And I trust you. I don't have to have kind of constant surveillance and know where you are every single minute of the day. I just know that when there's a difficult decision to be made, you will act in service to our shared cause, to our shared relationship. That I think that there's a tendency, particularly with the push toward kind of more professionalization and more systems, structures being imposed on nonprofits to make them run more like businesses, that we have to have all of these complex processes and systems in place in order to get to this. But really, I think this is getting back to the basics of behaving in a way that you would want to have others behave towards you, whether you're an individual or an organization, and constantly practicing that golden rule. And that will reinforce itself, that you will find others of like mind. And there may be mistakes, there may be missteps where somebody that you thought you could trust may actually turn out to be somebody who isn't delivering on their promise and their commitments. And there should be a way, perhaps at the outset, if you have open communication, you can certainly use formal contracts. Habitat Egypt used formal contracts because it was required by Habitat International headquarters in Georgia, that they have formal detailed contracts of what was going to happen in all these different circumstances. And it was difficult because the Habitat regional director describes it like you're trying to enter into a marriage, and then here Habitat International is forcing us to require prenuptial agreement. So it was kind of a tricky thing to have happen. But at the same time, he said, it was a useful exercise for us because we had to talk through all of these possible scenarios and what would happen and how there might be an exit strategy where if things didn't work out, we could exit gracefully without hurting each other. And even though the prenup or the contract wasn't what was making everybody behave and engage in a committed, high trust way, the process itself created an understanding amongst the participants of what people valued, how they would behave, and their commitment to the relationship. So you can have those systems and structures in place, but I don't think those are the key basis. It really is just trust between people, trust between a group of people within and across organizations that really makes these networks tick. The people who do this work are very, very strong at relationship building. I mean, they're just great people, but they're not charismatic leaders in the conventional sense. They typically don't seek the spotlight. They're not necessarily great at the podium, but they're very kind of visionary thinkers, but happy to be servant leaders and lead from behind and work in a quiet way to get to impact. And the impact itself is a reward for them, not the recognition and the hoopla that might come from being at the helm of the organization when it happens. So it's a different type of leadership and personality than what we might typically think of as admirable in the field. But I think it's far more powerful, particularly for social impact work, where we know it's not just manufacturing widgets and we just need to manufacture more widgets and we'll make a lot of money and create great shareholder value. We're talking about social change, working deeply in communities, working across so many different contexts and systems to get to sustainable change, that you need people who are willing and capable of working in this way to get that change to happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I want to point out that you did put the link to the 5 steps to building an effective impact network. And there's one other question in there. So Jane, if you want to kind of take a look at what Vicki from Alberta is asking. We don't have a slide for this, so I do want to just share what these 5 steps are, and then people can go to the article, because I found this really helpful in, okay, what's the fundamental process of helping people engage with the 4 principles? And what your article says is, clarify purpose, convene the right people, cultivate trust, coordinate actions, and collaborate generously. Mm-hmm. And so I think this will really help people with, like, what do I do next, or how do I do this? Because these points really illustrate in a very concrete way, what do you do to achieve what you've been talking about today. So we just have a few more minutes left on the call. Is there something else you want to say to Vicki with her question?
Yeah, I think as far as guideposts or indicators, I think it really is doing the legwork and talking to others who have experience working with a potential partner to find out what's their reputation. I think one example I know of, Hawaii Community Foundation was looking for people to convene and bring together for a network that they were working on. And they were very deliberate. They said, we didn't try to find the usual suspects, the most prominent organizations, the most prominent leaders. What we did was we interviewed all these different people and asked them for who they admired, who had a good reputation for working collaboratively, working toward mission impact, and leading from behind. And more often than not, you'll start to see that the same people the same names or organizations start to surface. It takes a little bit of legwork to do that, but it really is just kind of scoping out who has a reputation for doing this already. And I think you're far better off doing that than trying to find a partner that looks good on paper and trying to force them to adopt this new set of principles and teach them along the way. And again, I'm very confident that there are many, many people and organizations out there already who work in this way, but they're under-recognized, and they may just be kind of working quietly behind the scenes, getting a lot of impact achieved, but just not necessarily sought out as partners, and talking to others in the field. And another example within World Wildlife Fund, US, I have a case on that where they were trying to make the organization more networked, because historically the organization had been kind of siloed in their approach. They have global operations in multiple countries, but they weren't getting the impacts at the macro network level. And one of the ways they sought to find good examples for their staff to learn from, the CEO of WWF US just went around asking people in operations all over their global field operations, what are you most proud of in your work? What accomplishment that we've achieved in WWF US would you be most proud of? And interestingly, in his global tour, the same example kept cropping up. And then he went and looked at that example. It was a networked example. That's what I've written up in the case. And he said, wow, that's so fascinating. This example keeps coming up, but it was an exception rather than the rule. How can I make that type of phenomenon more the norm rather than the exception? And so the CEO, and the case is about how the CEO is trying to institutionalize this. And it's early in the process, so it doesn't have the right answers, but you see an organization that's trying to figure it out. But in any case, the process for finding it wasn't scientific. It was much more around what makes you most proud in your work, or who has the best reputation for working well as a partner. That kind of probing is probably one of the most underutilized things that philanthropists, funders do in the field of finding really high potential collaborative leaders to invest in. Instead, what do? They do the opposite. They say, here's an RFP, we want grant proposals, and you need to self-promote and say all the great things that you do and what you're going to achieve and what you have achieved. And it's almost attracting the exact opposite of what you need for very successful and thriving collaborations. So the norms in the field do need to change, and that is indeed what I'm working on, trying to help move the needle on.
Yes, you are, and you are moving the needle. And what you shared today and what you shared before with us is helpful. And you have such a body of work that we want to be sure people see the resources on the screen. And there are additional resources that we'll be sending when we send this the link to this. So just so appreciate your groundbreaking work here and you sharing it with us. And just also wanted to let people know that we do have a track at the Children in Nature Network conferences in St. Paul next May called Growing Successful Grassroots Networks. And Jane's work has been instrumental in shaping what that track will look like and what stories will be shared there. We're hoping that Kyle McDonald from Outdoors Empowered Network, Jose Gonzalez from Latino Outdoors, and David Cohen from Intertwine in Oregon will be there hopefully to share their success stories because they are following, have been following the same kind of process that Jane is promoting. So, Jane, we are out of time, but many thanks, and we look forward to working with you in the future as we help grow this Children in Nature movement.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm always interested in supporting leaders, practitioners in the field to do this work. So if I can be of help, please feel free to reach out and we'll schedule a call or correspond by email. I'm happy to do that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.